I sat in the silence of the living room, the weight of my father's words still hanging in the air, thick and suffocating. The barbecue was long over, and the house felt unnervingly quiet. The distant hum of the neighbor's lawnmower filtered in from the window, but inside, it was as though the world had stopped spinning. I had walked away from the crowd, away from the laughter and the warmth, seeking refuge in the house. I couldn't bear to be around them anymore. My own family, the people who should have been the ones to lift me up, had turned me into nothing more than a joke. As I sat there, I thought about the years that had led up to this moment. My father had always been a man of few words, but when he spoke, it wasn't always kind. I remember the times when I was younger, when I would do something small, something that I thought would earn me a smile or a nod from him. Instead, I was met with indifference or harsh words. I remember the first time I tried to show him my report card, the one with straight A's, the one I had worked so hard for. He barely glanced at it before tossing it aside. "That's nice," he'd said, not even looking me in the eye. I used to think that maybe if I just tried harder, he'd see me, really see me. But now, sitting in that empty house, I realized I had been chasing a ghost. I wasn't just an accident in his eyes. I was invisible. As I reached for the letter my mother had written, I felt a pang in my chest. I hadn't even known she had kept these letters. She had always been the quiet one in the family, the one who never rocked the boat. But as I read her words, I began to understand. She had known what my father was like. She had known how he felt about me before I was even born. The letter was filled with hope, but there was an underlying sadness in her words. She wrote about her hopes for the future, about wanting to give me a life full of love and warmth. But even in those early days, she had sensed the distance between me and my father. "He's distant," she wrote. "I hope he comes around, but I'm not sure. It's like there's something missing in him." I ran my fingers over the letter, the ink slightly faded with age. I could feel my mother's love, but I also felt her frustration. She had tried so hard to make things work, to make me feel like I belonged. But all these years, I had been living in the shadow of a man who never wanted me, and a woman who was too afraid to tell me the truth. I put the letter down and let out a long breath. The truth was hard to swallow, but it was clear now. I wasn't the mistake my father had called me. I was a child of two people who had never really been on the same page, and it was time for me to stop pretending it was otherwise. I didn't know what to do with this newfound truth. I didn't know if I should confront my father's ghost or let it go. But one thing was certain. I was done being invisible. I sat in the silence of the living room, the weight of my father's words still hanging in the air, thick and suffocating. The barbecue was long over, and the house felt unnervingly quiet. The distant hum of the neighbor's lawnmower filtered in from the window, but inside, it was as though the world had stopped spinning. I had walked away from the crowd, away from the laughter and the warmth, seeking refuge in the house. I couldn't bear to be around them anymore. My own family, the people who should have been the ones to lift me up, had turned me into nothing more than a joke. As I sat there, I thought about the years that had led up to this moment. My father had always been a man of few words, but when he spoke, it wasn't always kind. I remember the times when I was younger, when I would do something small, something that I thought would earn me a smile or a nod from him. Instead, I was met with indifference or harsh words. I remember the first time I tried to show him my report card, the one with straight A's, the one I had worked so hard for. He barely glanced at it before tossing it aside. "That's nice," he'd said, not even looking me in the eye. I used to think that maybe if I just tried harder, he'd see me, really see me. But now, sitting in that empty house, I realized I had been chasing a ghost. I wasn't just an accident in his eyes. I was invisible. As I reached for the letter my mother had written, I felt a pang in my chest. I hadn't even known she had kept these letters. She had always been the quiet one in the family, the one who never rocked the boat. But as I read her words, I began to understand. She had known what my father was like. She had known how he felt about me before I was even born. The letter was filled with hope, but there was an underlying sadness in her words. She wrote about her hopes for the future, about wanting to give me a life full of love and warmth. But even in those early days, she had sensed the distance between me and my father. "He's distant," she wrote. "I hope he comes around, but I'm not sure. It's like there's something missing in him." I ran my fingers over the letter, the ink slightly faded with age. I could feel my mother's love, but I also felt her frustration. She had tried so hard to make things work, to make me feel like I belonged. But all these years, I had been living in the shadow of a man who never wanted me, and a woman who was too afraid to tell me the truth. I put the letter down and let out a long breath. The truth was hard to swallow, but it was clear now. I wasn't the mistake my father had called me. I was a child of two people who had never really been on the same page, and it was time for me to stop pretending it was otherwise. I didn't know what to do with this newfound truth. I didn't know if I should confront my father's ghost or let it go. But one thing was certain. I was done being invisible. I didn't know how long I sat in that room, just staring at the letter, letting my thoughts swirl around in my head. The house was silent, almost eerily so, but the silence didn't bother me anymore. It felt peaceful in a way. The noise in my head had quieted down. I wasn't angry anymore. I was exhausted, yes, but there was something else, something I couldn't quite place. Maybe it was relief, the kind that comes when you finally accept a truth that's been hiding in the shadows for years. I wasn't an accident. I had never been an accident. My father had made a choice, just like everyone else. The choice to push me aside, to let his bitterness dictate how he treated me. But that didn't define me. I wasn't going to let it. I put the letter back in the drawer, a place where it could rest but still be a reminder. A reminder that I had always had a choice. I could move forward. I could rebuild myself. The next day, I found myself walking through the park. The trees were lush with green, and the air smelled of fresh earth, the kind of smell that only comes after a good rain. I hadn't been to this park in years, but something about it felt right. It was like stepping back into a part of my past that I had left behind. As I walked along the path, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I fumbled for it, unsure of who could be calling at this hour. When I looked at the screen, it was my brother, Ethan Turner. I hadn't heard from him in weeks. My heart skipped a beat, a little flutter of hope mixed with the same old anxiety. "Hello," I said, my voice uncertain. "Hey, Lily." Ethan's voice came through, calm but warm. "I've been thinking about you. How are you doing?" His words were simple, but there was a sincerity in them that I hadn't heard in a long time. It felt nice to hear him, to hear that he still cared, even though everything between our parents had made things so complicated. My heart raced. The thought of more secrets, more things my father had hidden, made my stomach twist. "What did he say?" I asked, the question slipping out before I could stop it. It's not good, Lily. But I think you should hear it. I can send them to you, if you're ready." I stood still in the middle of the park, the world around me quiet, the only sound being the gentle rustling of leaves in the wind. A part of me wanted to hang up, to pretend it wasn't happening. But I knew I couldn't do that anymore. I had to face it all. I had to know the truth. "Send them to me," I said, my voice steady but firm. "I'm ready." The rest of the afternoon passed slowly, the anticipation hanging over me like a dark cloud. When I finally returned home, I opened my laptop and waited for the email to arrive. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, my heart pounding in my chest. When the email finally came through, I clicked on it without hesitation. There, attached to the message, were several scanned copies of my father's letters to my mother. I opened the first one and started reading, my eyes scanning the words. Each letter was filled with frustration and resentment, not just toward me, but toward the life he had built. I could feel the anger in his words, the bitterness that had poisoned everything in our family. But there was something else, too, a deep, painful regret. He had never wanted to be a father, but he had been forced into it. He resented every responsibility that came with it, every sacrifice my mother made for us. It was a heavy burden to bear, and reading those words made me feel like I was drowning. Once did. I wasn't angry anymore. The bitterness had started to fade, replaced by something far more powerful, understanding. My father's regret, his resentment, his anger, they were all born of a life he had never wanted. And I couldn't change that. But I could change how I let it affect me. I took a deep breath and stared out the window, watching the cars pass by on the street. Everything felt different now. It was like I was seeing the world with new eyes. The way people moved, the way they interacted, it all seemed so much clearer. I had spent my life being a part of the background, trying to fit into a space that was never meant for me. I had tried to earn the love of a man who never had the capacity to give it. But now, for the first time, I felt like I was standing in my own space, free from the shadow of his indifference. I picked up the phone and dialed my brother's number, the one person who had always been there, even when everything else felt uncertain. It rang a few times before he picked up. "Hey, Lily." Ethan's voice was warm, a little surprised but still familiar. I was just thinking about you. I know, I said, my voice steady. I've been thinking about everything. There was a long pause on the other end. What do you mean? He asked, his voice cautious but not distant. I found the letters, Ethan, I said. I know everything now. I could feel the tension on the other side of the line. I'm sorry you had to see that, he said, his voice quieter. I never meant for you to know, but I knew you had a right to. I just didn't know how to tell you. It's okay, I said, surprising myself with how calm I sounded. I'm not angry anymore. I understand now. I just wish I had known sooner. But maybe this is how it was supposed to happen. You're stronger than I gave you credit for, Ethan said, his tone shifting. I always thought you needed to hear it from Dad, but maybe you didn't. Maybe you needed to hear it from yourself. I felt a wave of emotion wash over me, but it wasn't sadness or anger. It was relief, the kind that comes with finally letting go of something that has been holding you back. I'm not going to let him define me anymore, I said, the words coming out more confidently than I had ever expected. I'm going to build my own life, Ethan. And this time, I'm doing it for me. I'm proud of you, Lily, he replied, his voice thick with emotion. You've always been stronger than I ever knew. I hung up the phone, feeling a sense of peace that I hadn't felt in years. My father's words no longer had the power to hurt me. I wasn't a mistake. I wasn't an accident. I was me. And for the first time in my life, I was okay with that. I woke up the next morning with a strange sense of clarity. The fog that had clouded my thoughts for so long had finally started to lift, and for the first time in years, I felt like I was breathing deeply, truly breathing. The house was quiet, the sun streaming through the windows, casting long shadows on the floor. I walked to the kitchen and poured myself a cup of coffee, savoring the warmth of the mug in my hands. I wasn't running from anything anymore. I had spent so much of my life trying to outrun my father's disappointment, my own feelings of inadequacy, but now I saw it all for what it truly was. His struggle, not mine. The day stretched out before me, full of possibilities I hadn't allowed myself to consider before. I had spent so much time thinking I needed his approval, his validation, but now I understood that it was my own approval I needed. I didn't need him to tell me I was worth something. I had to find that worth within myself. I made a decision then, sitting at the kitchen table, staring at the steaming cup of coffee in front of me. I was going to start over. It wasn't about leaving the past behind. It was about carrying it with me, learning from it, and creating something new. I wasn't going to let the past dictate my future any longer. I was no longer a product of my father's neglect. I was something different, something stronger. I spent the day going through the old house, sorting through things I had left untouched for years. My mind wandered back to the times when I had felt like I was invisible, like I was just a placeholder in my family's life, someone who didn't truly belong. But now, as I looked at each object, each photograph, I saw them for what they were, pieces of a life I had lived. They weren't just reminders of pain, of neglect. They were part of me, part of the woman I was becoming. As I moved through the house, I found myself smiling at little things, small details I had once overlooked. The old photographs on the mantel, the chipped coffee mug my mother had always used, the chair where I had sat as a child, listening to my parents' arguments. It all felt different now. I wasn't just seeing the flaws, the mistakes. I was seeing the beauty in the ordinary, the things that had once seemed so insignificant. I started packing up the items I wanted to keep, the ones that held meaning for me, the ones that would help me move forward. It felt cathartic, like I was letting go of all the old baggage that had weighed me down. I wasn't holding on to the past anymore. I was ready for what came next. Later that evening, I sat down to write a letter to my brother, Ethan. I hadn't told him everything that had happened, hadn't told him how deeply my father's words had hurt me, but I was ready now. I needed him to know that I was okay, that I was finally at peace with the past. I wrote about the letter from my mother, about the truth I had uncovered, and about the journey I was about to begin. I wasn't asking for forgiveness, and I wasn't looking for sympathy. I just needed him to understand that I was ready to live my life on my terms. When I finished the letter, I folded it and set it aside. For the first time in my life, I wasn't waiting for someone else to tell me it was okay. I didn't need anyone else's approval. I was enough, just as I was. The weight that had been hanging over me for so long had lifted, and I felt a lightness in my chest I hadn't known was possible. I wasn't broken. I was whole, and I was ready to move forward. I stood at the window, watching the sun set over the neighborhood, the orange and pink hues painting the sky. It felt like the world was finally waking up, like everything was shifting, slowly but surely. I wasn't the same person I had been a month ago, or even a week ago. It was like I had shed an old skin, and now I was something new, something stronger. The weight of the past, the years of trying to live up to expectations that were never mine to meet, had finally lifted. I was standing on my own, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of it. The phone buzzed on the counter, snapping me out of my thoughts. I glanced at the screen. It was a message from Ethan. "How are you doing?" he asked. I smiled to myself as I typed a quick reply. "I'm doing better than I ever have. I think I'm finally starting to understand everything." I sent the message and leaned back against the counter, letting out a deep breath. It felt good to be honest, even if it was just to myself. I had spent so much time hiding, keeping everything locked away. But now, I could finally face it all, no matter how difficult. I wasn't alone in this anymore. I had my brother, Ethan, and for the first time in years, I felt like I could trust him with everything. I knew that he didn't have all the answers, that he couldn't fix everything, but that didn't matter. What mattered was that he was there, that he understood me in a way no one else ever had. I was sitting in the living room, the quiet hum of the house filling the space around me, when I heard a knock at the door. My heart skipped a beat. I wasn't expecting anyone. I stood up and walked to the door, my hand shaking slightly as I reached for the handle. When I opened it, I was surprised to see Claire standing there. She was my aunt, my mother's sister, and I hadn't seen her in years. Her eyes softened when she saw me, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. There was so much left unsaid between us, so much distance that had grown over the years. But then, she stepped forward, wrapped her arms around me, and whispered, "I'm so sorry, Lily. I should have been there for you. I should have seen what was happening, and I didn't." I froze, my breath caught in my chest. It wasn't what I had expected. I had spent so many years holding on to the bitterness of my father's rejection. But here was Claire, standing before me, offering an apology I hadn't even known I needed. "It's not your fault," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "It wasn't your responsibility." She pulled back, wiping the tears from her eyes, and gave me a small smile. "It may not have been, but I still should have been there for you. I should have known how hard things were for you." I looked at her, really looked at her for the first time in years. She wasn't just my aunt anymore. She was a person, just like me, with her own pain, her own regrets. And for the first time, I realized that maybe she had always been there, in her own way. "You are here now," I said, and for the first time in a long time, I meant it. "And that's enough." She nodded, her smile growing a little wider. "It's never too late to start over," she said softly. "And I'm here, whenever you're ready to talk." I smiled back at her, feeling something shift inside me. It wasn't a miracle. It wasn't some sudden, sweeping change. But it was enough. For the first time, I didn't feel like I had to carry the weight of the past by myself. There were people who cared, people who understood, and people who were willing to walk beside me as I figured out the next chapter. I wasn't alone anymore. And that made all the difference. I woke up the next morning with a strange calmness. The events of the previous days didn't seem to weigh on me as they once had. I had spent so much of my life walking through the motions, just trying to survive the next day, trying to prove that I was worth something. But now, for the first time, I felt like I had control of my life. It wasn't about fixing everything, or about suddenly finding some grand solution. It was about the simple act of choosing to move forward. I stood in front of the mirror, staring at my reflection. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I was looking at a stranger. I saw myself, really saw myself. I was no longer defined by my father's rejection or my mother's silence. I was just me. And for once, that was enough. My phone buzzed, interrupting my thoughts. It was a message from Ethan. "I'm coming over later. We need to talk about some things." My heart skipped a beat. It wasn't like we hadn't talked before, but something in the way he phrased it made me feel like this conversation would be different. I wasn't sure what he wanted to say, but I felt ready. I had been avoiding difficult conversations for too long, running from the things I couldn't control. But not today. Today, I would face whatever was coming. When Ethan arrived, I let him in without a word. His expression was serious, and I could tell that whatever he had to say, he had been thinking about it for a while. He sat down across from me, his hands folded tightly in his lap. "Lily," he started, his voice unsteady. I've been thinking a lot about everything that's happened, about how things have changed between us. He paused, as if searching for the right words. I know I haven't been there for you the way I should have. I don't know if I can make up for that, but I want you to know that I'm here now. I'm sorry for everything. His words hung in the air, and for a moment, I couldn't speak. My brother, the one person I had always thought of as my anchor, had been absent when I needed him most. But now, he was here, sitting in front of me, offering the one thing I had been longing for, an apology. I didn't know how to respond at first. All those years of trying to hold my family together, of hiding my pain, of pretending everything was fine, it all came rushing back. But as I looked at Ethan, I realized something important. I wasn't alone anymore. I didn't have to carry the burden by myself. I appreciate you saying that, Ethan, I said quietly. But I'm not angry anymore. I know things weren't perfect, but we can't change the past. What matters is what we do from here. His eyes softened, and he nodded slowly. I want to be here for you, Lily. I want to be part of your life again. I smiled at him, feeling a sense of peace I hadn't known was possible. You already are, I said. Just being here, just showing up, that's enough for me. The rest of the afternoon passed quietly. Ethan and I talked about the past, about everything that had gone wrong, but also about everything that had gone right. We didn't have all the answers, but that was okay. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel the need to have all the answers. I didn't have to fix everything. I just had to keep moving forward, one step at a time. As the sun set outside, casting a golden light over the room, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was living, and that was enough. I woke up the next morning with a sense of calm that felt foreign, yet comforting. The weight that had been pressing down on me for so long had finally lifted, and as I sat up in bed, I realized that I wasn't just waking up to another day. I was waking up to a new chapter of my life. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting soft light into the room. The world outside felt quiet, serene, as if it was waiting for me to make my move. I felt a shift within me, a quiet but resolute understanding that I was no longer bound by the past, no longer defined by the hurt that had once held me back. I stood up and moved to the window, looking out at the street below. It was a small, unremarkable neighborhood, but in that moment, it felt like everything had changed. The old me, the one who constantly sought approval, who believed she wasn't enough, was gone. I wasn't sure what came next, but I knew I didn't have to figure it out all at once. I didn't need to rush. I wasn't running anymore. I had spent so much of my life chasing after something that wasn't even real, something I could never have. But now, I had everything I needed within me. It was time to let go of the need for validation from people who had never been able to give it. I was enough, just as I was. Later that day, I decided to take a walk. It was one of those days where the air felt crisp and the world seemed to breathe with you. I walked for hours, with no destination in mind. I wasn't lost, though. I was just walking, letting my mind wander and process everything. The sense of freedom, of choice, was almost overwhelming. I had lived for so long as if I was a passenger in my own life, letting others take the wheel. But now I was driving. And for the first time, I didn't feel afraid. By the time I returned home, the sun had begun to set, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink. I sat down on the porch, my hands resting in my lap, and just watched the world go by. I didn't need anything else. The peace I felt, the acceptance of myself, was enough. I had come to terms with the past, not by forgetting it, but by accepting it as part of my story. It was no longer the part that defined me. I was free. As the evening crept in, I felt a deep sense of gratitude. I was grateful for the lessons, for the pain that had taught me to be stronger, for the people in my life who had shown me what real love and support looked like. And most of all, I was grateful for myself, for having the courage to keep going, even when it felt like everything was falling apart. I had survived, and now I was living. The next chapter was mine to write, and for the first time, I was excited to see what it would bring.